This is Kyle Ferriter from RENCI at UNC-Chapel Hill, close to us, inside of RENCI. His talk title today is OpenID Connect, Authentication in iRODS. Now you've got a mic up there.
All right, hey, I'm Kyle. I work at RENCI, and I've been doing work over the last few months on enabling OpenID Connect authentication in iRODS as another way to authenticate besides PAM and Kerberos and native authentication. Okay. So as some background for what sort of prompted this, we have a project with the NIH Data Commons, which is to provide a cross-cloud platform for scientists to run data analysis. And we have a front-end application, and we also have a cross-cloud compute platform running DCOS and Mesos. And we're working on Kubernetes as well. That's not currently working, but we're working on it. And we're also using iRODS as the whole data management and backend and metadata abstraction layer behind that. So the assumption here is that all of the users of the data commons are going to have an existing OpenID Connect identity, either through InCommon or CI Logon, which provides an OpenID layer in front of InCommon, or an OrcID, which also implements OpenID, or a Google account through like a Google Apps through the university, or a Globus account, or really any other identity provider which could be wrapped into OpenID format. OpenID is really made so it's easy to authenticate through front ends. There's sort of a three-legged authentication flow that works well in web apps. iRODS is not a web app. So that's what my work has been doing to sort of get it to work there. So since the users are going to have an existing identity, there's no reason for us to create them a whole new set of credentials for iRODS. We can reuse their OpenID credentials, username, and tokens essentially as the login mechanism to iRODS. So what we do is on the front end, when a user first comes to our platform, we generate a brand new iRODS user that has their edu person name or preferred username or email address as the iRODS username. And then there's no password on that account. We map their OpenID subject name into the auth name field, which is also used for Kerberos authentication. And then everything else from there on is managed by a new auth plugin, which is using new functionality in iRODS core, which allows for pluggable authentication. So what's the goal? The goal is to provide an alternative authentication mechanism for iRODS users and import their existing identities from an OpenID Connect or OAuth 2 platform. Most OAuth 2 providers are also now providing OpenID Connect. Some do not. But in order to authenticate, we need to have the ID part of that, not just the authorization from OAuth 2. And if you don't know, OpenID is just an extension on top of OAuth 2. Now, I assume most people know what OAuth 2 is. I was going to explain it, but I figured most people already knew. And also, coming along with this, you can log in with OpenID Connect, but you can also enable other iRODS plugins to access OAuth 2 protected APIs on their behalf. An example of this would be Google Drive, Dropbox, or Globus Transfer. I know a lot of people have been demanding Globus integration into iRODS, and that is on its way. It sort of works now. It's in beta. Hopefully it will be done soon, and we are using it in limited capabilities in our platform already. So what is the architecture here? This is a really simple diagram. So you have your iRODS client side and your iRODS server. You initiate an auth login request. If you do not have a token on your iRODS client already, the iRODS server will spit you out a URL. OpenID is a browser-based authentication system, so we need the user to actually log in with a URL in their browser. We can't automate that unless you already have a token. I'll give an example of this later so it makes more sense. But you will get back a URL to log in. Your iRODS client will sit there and wait for you to log in. By default, it'll wait 60 seconds, but that is configurable. You do want that to be pretty low, though, because you don't want those URLs to just be forever, because if you leave a URL sitting somewhere someone else can log in, well, they can't really log in, but you don't really want those to be spread around. In the iRODS catalog, we store just session information to keep track of who's logged in. We also have a microservice that I developed as well. This provides the web server capabilities. Originally, I had written a web server that lived inside the iRODS server plugin. That was a little brittle. It basically was serving port 8080 and doing like HTML parsing is not good. So this Auth Microservice is a Django app, essentially, with an encrypted database to store tokens. When the user logs in with the URL that they got on their client, the token authorization code will be sent to the microservice. The iRODS server can detect that the microservice received the token, and then it'll complete the authorization flow. We also can do introspection. OAuth token introspection is to check whether a token is still valid or whether it has expired or been revoked. OAuth and OpenID give the user a lot of control over their credentials, so a user could change their password in their OpenID provider and keep the token still valid, or they can go in and revoke the token, in which case all the tokens that they have issued to clients will be revoked immediately. And we want to sort of detect that that has happened before we just use it to do a call and the call fails. We actually want to know, like, okay, the user did actually revoke their token. And again, I'll give an example of this later. So the main features, we can simultaneously support in iRODS authentication through an arbitrary number of OIDC providers. Examples would be Globus, Google. Those are the main ones we've been testing with right now. But CI Logon would be another popular one. And you can do all of them simultaneously. And then the admin, the iRODS admin, when the user accounts are created, can decide, okay, this user is using Globus, this user is doing Google, and both of them can use their own provider simultaneously. We can also support multiple OIDC identities per iRODS user. So an iRODS user might have identities in multiple platforms, like a Google identity that they want to use for some things, like university stuff, and then they might have some other identity somewhere else that they want to use for other things, and we can support that. One thing we can't support right now is multiple identities from the same provider. And I don't know how common a use case that would be, so I'm not going to focus on that. You can also have multiple iRODS accounts linked to the same identity. I'm not sure how useful that is, but it is there as a use case in case people want it. It is supported. One of the main benefits to using OpenID is that client applications don't have any passwords stored for a user. So the user can go and change their password in Google, and iRODS will not care whether the password changed. It'll keep working. And iRODS is also not storing any raw access tokens. So this is what that microservice was for on the previous page. iRODS doesn't have any tokens in it, which is also good. The last bullet point here, we can also opaquely utilize identity provider functionality. So examples of this would be identity providers. You sometimes can configure a timeout on tokens. Say, like, a lot of identity providers provide refresh tokens that you can refresh your primary access token and stay logged in essentially indefinitely, which can be good and also can be bad. If your identity provider provides the functionality to have a time limit on refreshing, say like 3 months or anything really, iRODS will just accept that and respect the provider's settings. So if your provider says, okay, this user can stay logged into your client for 6 weeks and then they have to log in again, we can handle that. We can also handle multi-factor auth through providers as well. I don't have this working right now, but in the next week or two, I will have, for our platform, for the NIH Data Commons, we'll have multi-factor auth. Examples of this would be like an email. If you have to like go click on some link, or a text message or some other thing, like a secondary password or something. And this would be settings in the identity provider. So in Google, you can set up multi-factor auth. And Google has like 5 different options for different types of multi-factor auth, including Google Authenticator app and like time-based token rotations. And iRODS it doesn't care about that. It can just accept multi-factor auth. And if you set your provider to be a provider with multi-factor auth enabled, which we'll do, it will just automatically do multi-factor auth. Also, again, it gives the user a lot of control over their identity. They can go in and revoke their access to iRODS through like the Google's web page. You can go say, you gave access to iRODS to see your identity. They can click revoke this access, and their credentials will be locked immediately, which is nice for the user. If you're running things like asynchronously in the background, it'll probably break those, but it's good. It's there as an option. This real-time validity checking of access tokens and checking whether the user revoked it does have a performance penalty. It about doubles the amount of time it takes to authenticate, which is still low. It's well under a second, under half a second. But it does have a performance penalty. If you're running a lot of authentication requests all over the place, like hundreds per second, it will have a penalty there. But we can cache those validity checks. So like by default, it's caching it for 60 seconds. So it'll check whether the user has revoked the access token as long as it has been checked and has been seen as valid within the last 60 seconds. And that really helps out the performance. So some details on that microservice I mentioned before. It's used to initiate the authorization code flow because when the user logs in, their token is being sent to this microservice. So the URL you get actually points to this microservice as the redirect. It's also used to generate cryptographically secure nonce and state values. These are used in the URL. Each URL that's spit out by the iRODS server is globally unique for that iRODS server. So those will never be reused, or theoretically never be reused. Well, they'll never be reused in any lifespan of what you're doing. And we use that to check and figure out who actually initiated this request and map that to the person who actually logged in with the URL. And if those don't match, we reject the request. It also provides a REST API for centralized token management between our stack components. So I mentioned we have an iRODS backend doing our data management. We also have a web application. This token service REST API allows you to look up tokens and do a lot of token operations between those without storing tokens separately and having like mismatched tokens, and some tokens are expired in different parts of your stack. So iRODS and our front-end web application both talk to the same token database through a REST API. And that REST API allows us to have like standardized format for those requests and also authentic API key authentication on that. It also automatically refreshes the tokens, doing a lot of web work that is tricky to do in iRODS or not very clean to do in iRODS. And I mentioned before, it also does validation of the tokens. So it checks to see whether the token has expired. I mentioned before, it stores the tokens, and you can configure all of that, the encryption key and all of that. Other information on the service, this is where you define your providers. So on the right-hand side, I have an example of the JSON document that defines the configuration for a service. So here the redirect URI is whatever endpoint this service is visible on. This has to be a resolvable host by your provider. So if your provider is Google, Google needs to be able to know where this host is. And all of these are just standard OpenID Auth2 fields. This is standards-based and OpenID Connect OAuth2. Some providers don't comply very nicely with the standards, so we have to do a little bit of work there, especially Google doesn't follow the standards very nicely. Globus does pretty much, but Google will sometimes just change the name of fields for no reason really, even though it's the same value. It just complicates our code. Coming in the future, we're going to have JSON Web Token authentication, which is another form. Instead of opaque access tokens, JSON Web Token is something that an identity provider like our Stack front end can publish some details about the user and sign it and say, okay, this is true and you can trust that this is real. And it allows us to embed information in the token non-opaquely. In order to get iRODS to talk to the service, you just tell it, this is in the server config.json. I added a new key for OpenID, and these 3 values you can provide. The bottom 2 are required. The token service is that same URL that was before. Whatever host it's running on, it can be a path or anything really. A different port, this is by default 443. It does have to be SSL enabled. You cannot use just plain HTTP for OpenID. And then the service key, which enables it to talk to it. So it's pretty easy to add into iRODS. Security considerations here. Privileges that microservice we have running is running as its own Unix account, which really doesn't have sudo or SSH access. It is potentially vulnerable to denial of service. It does have API keys, but again, you can really flood the network with requests. We don't really handle that right now, but we're not too concerned about that at the moment. It does use AES-256 encryption at rest, and the keys can be loaded dynamically either off the file system or through the environment, and those can be rotated or whatever you need. It does require you to have SSL set up in your iRODS instance. If you do not, it just won't work. You have to have SSL for transferring these tokens and all that. The nice thing there is respecting the user consent, so we withdraw credentials as soon as, well, by default within 60 seconds of when the user withdraws their consent. And we also, those login URLs, we time those out also in, I believe, 60 seconds by default. So if they don't use that URL within 60 seconds, it'll just become invalid and it won't accept it. Okay, so I can do quick to show you that it actually works. I'm not lying. Oof. Can everyone read that? Okay, so here at the top, I have my iRODS environment.json. I can change the iRODS authentication scheme to be OpenID. It'll just use that. That's the same way you set it to use PAN or Kerberos. I'm using a self-signed certificate right now for the SSL communications. Ideally, in production, you want it to be an actual certificate. So here I disable verification on SSL. You can also set your OpenID provider. If you don't specify this, the iRODS server, you can configure a default one. So if you have all your users using the same OpenID provider, you can just specify it in the server and say, okay, use my Google Apps provider, and then the user does not have to specify it here, but they can. If their iRODS account is actually not linked to that provider, though, it won't let them in. So that's good. So here I can run init, and as I said, it spit out a URL. Let's see if I can click on this. Yes, okay. So you didn't see what happened, but over here, I was redirected in my web browser to Globus Auth. I was already logged into my Globus account and my UNC account, which is being passed through Globus. It says successfully authenticated, so that's nice. That's just a little message I put there. That can be changed to something more pretty if you want. So you can see that the command exited. Before it was hanging and waiting for 60 seconds until it noticed that I was logged in. And now you can see that I am actually logged in. So I'm just authenticated through OpenID now. Just to prove also that we are doing real-time consent validation. Here's my Globus consents. These are OAuth 2. This is a record of which applications this user, me, has authorized to use my credentials. So I think the second one is Common Share, which is our platform. Is that on the X? Okay, say yes. Go back over here. And it locked me out. So yes, it did notice that I had revoked my consent. And this also works through the Python iRODS client now. I have a demo of that as well, but I think we're getting close to the end here. Anything else? So other steps coming. The main one is iRODS integration. So OpenID worked really nicely through HTTP browsers. I'm hoping to get iRODS integrated with that. I have a preliminary working solution. It's not very nice though, so I'm not going to publish that. But we are hoping to use an OpenID module that exists for Apache so that we can have users log in through iRODS, OpenID as well. Any questions? And this is going to be used in the resource plugin I mentioned before for Globus.
Yes. Are there any questions? Yeah, we have a couple. You go, Derek.
Hi, when you were setting up the binding to your Globus ID, what cooperation did you need from the from Globus to make that work?
Globus already federates with all the in-common providers.
But isn't right? That's not the problem. The problem is what did you do when you didn't? There had to be some exchange to get a token, right? Okay. So the subscription is required to do that. Right.
Yeah,
It is
yeah.
now. I just wanted to confirm that was still the case.
Right, but you could use Google's setup and it would be free out the box.
And then in your configuration, you talked about setting up providers, and is that how you effectively vet which providers, authentication providers, you're willing to accept for your user base?
Yeah, so when the
Right.
client specifies their iRODS environment, which provider they want to use, those are directly mapped in to that ASM file like that. So whatever key you name on the back end, mine is just Google and Globus. If you name it something else, that iRODS environment variable will be different, depending on which provider you have configured.
So there's mapping components.
Okay.
So when I say, when the client asks for Google authentication through OpenID, it looks at the back end and sees which Google credentials to use, and then generates a URL with those Google credentials. So when they log in, it's logging in, granting a token to our application.
Okay, so it's probably a deeper conversation at some point with you, but I want to understand how to prevent people from using identity providers that I don't think meet a certain assurance level.
So if you're managing
So.
the Authentication Microservice, you define which provider to use. So John?
So slightly tangential question. You mentioned it locks out the iRODS account. How does it actually lock out the account?
The iRODS account, this is all. That's louder, yeah. So the iRODS server-side plugin is monitoring the microservice for whatever response it gives. And whenever it receives an auth request, the microservice goes out, looks at its cache. So you can configure the caching to 0, but by default it's 60, and it saves the cache for 60. And if it hasn't been checked within 60 seconds, it goes out to Google or Globus or whoever the provider is and asks them, is this token still valid? And that's a standard OAuth 2 flow there. It checks to see if it's valid. If it's not valid, it deletes it from the database because you don't want to store those tokens there. And then returns an error on the authentication.
Right. So that sounds like what you're doing is you're moving it from your database of tokens rather than locking the account within iRODS, the iRODS user account. Would that be fair?
So if it deletes the token, then the user has to log in again fresh. So do init and then log in again.
But the user account is still there, and you're not using anything within iRODS
Yeah.
to lock
Well,
it.
when I say locked, I mean there's no credentials. So even if you have an old credential, like a session key, that's no longer valid. You have to use init again. Yep.
Thank you.
So like if you accidentally left your computer, like in a computer lab, logged in, and you wanted to revoke all your iRODS credentials, you could do that, and then just log in again on your laptop.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kyle.